r/AskReddit. Serious, Redditors who live in secluded towns. What is the darkest thing that happened in your town, but is kept secret? I didn't live there, but about 20 minutes away. A farm town in Washington where the Mr. Hands incident occurred. People there still don't acknowledge the event. For the stid, a guy enticed a horse to penetrate him in the butt and inadvertently killed him. I grew up in Georgia. Hauled hay all my life. Just so happens I delivered hay to that farm a week before that event happened. Everyone knew those people were weird. But the money was green, and they paid above fair price. It's some weird shit. And he got fucked so hard by the horse it pretty much split him in two. Also didn't realize it had been that long. Damn. In the early 1990s, a town in my small county in the southern US had a fire in a chicken processing plant. When workers tried to escape, it became apparent that the fire exits and other exits had been locked. Dozens of people died around the exits in desperation in a town of around 2,000. Our state suppressed the investigation due to lobbies, and families received almost none of the compensation funds. Pretty sure there's a song about it. My mom told me this story once that back when she was growing up in a small farming community in Ohio, there was some kind of neighborhood party attended by a bunch of families with kids all around the same age. All the kids, including herself, had this like big slumber party in the basement. They wake up the next morning, and one of the kids is found in the middle of the road, having been hit with a truck, but with his whole body zipped all the way up in his sleeping bag. None of the kids owned up to doing and the adults could never figure it out either. After a while people just started moving on with their lives and everyone pretty much forgot about it. Edit. I didn't mean for this get attention and I can't reply to all of you, so I'll just say, this would be in Salina, Ohio around 1972. If anyone can find sources on it, go for it. I did some googling, and couldn't really come up with anything. And some of you, I think are right. My mom said she probably thinks it was a prank that went terribly wrong. My grandpa's father was murdered by the wealthiest man in town a long time ago. Not 100% sure of the exact year. Money exchanged hands with law enforcement, and nothing ever came of it. Until one day my grandpa's anger about the situation boiled over, and he threatened to kill the man in retribution. Law enforcement caught wind of it, and in order to save the cover-up, forced him to leave town or be arrested. He moved from that small town bordering two southern states, hint, it's a mashup name of the two states into one, up to Ohio. He met my grandma, and now I exist. So at least I can blame a murderer for every bad thing that happens to me, since I wouldn't have existed without his crime. A cop was a child molester, and it was widely known. He went with a group hunting in the woods and never came back. Several young boys, age 9 to 11, went missing in the village, and it was suspected that a group of boys from the same school were responsible. They were heard talking about it on 2 occasions, about how they kill whoever they don't like. However, their parents apparently attested that they never let them out of sight outside of school hours. This group of kids was known for skipping school to sniff glue and drink alcohol BTW, but their parents obviously denied it. Only one of the 6 missing kids was ever found in a creek with injuries like he was stoned to death. Police said he fell down the creek accidentally, though. This was about 20 years ago in Europe BTW. Nothing with me, but when my mom was a kid she lived near a state park in New Hampshire. It's called Bear Brook. In the 80s multiple dismembered body parts were found in a blue barrel. An investigation happened, but the killer was never found. In the early zeros another barrel was found, dating back to the time of the first barrel. The killer was recently found. His name was Robert Evans. The park is in Allenstown, if you want to look it up. A 17-year-old girl was raped and murdered when walking home from school. The wild town went into panic mode, and a homeless man was caught and arrested for the crime. Case closed, right? Later it was found out that she was in a relationship with a judge's son, and he plus some other guys from wealthy local families were seen in a car picking her up around the time of the crime. They all moved to different cities. Nothing ever came of it. Homeless man is still in jail. When my mom was growing up, a teacher and his wife were killed by an axe murderer. Someone broke into their house and killed them in the middle of the night. They found the husband in the house and the wife in the woods behind it, indicating that she tried to escape and was chased down. Really gruesome stuff. The attack was seemingly random, and they never caught the person responsible. My elementary school was named after the teacher, which wouldn't necessarily be morbid except for the fact that there was a dedication plaque that mentioned his murder in an elementary school. The 90s were fucking wild. My town isn't very secluded, but I think this still works. So there is this building that used to be a hotel, and one day this guy shows up, and he takes multiple trips going in and out with a bunch of equipment. They found him a little while later in his room. He had assembled an entire guillotine and cut his head off. Small town of about 2,000 to 2,500 in the Midwest, when suddenly about 1/4 of the population just up and left. No word, no nothing. None of them had kids or extended family and none of the papers said anything about it. This was back in maybe the late 80s. This happened when I was pretty young, but I just remember one day one of my teachers wasn't there, and I found out from my parents a ton of people had just left overnight. Most personal belongings were taken with them, but mattresses and furniture were still in their houses. I still have no clue what that was about, and when I've asked my parents more recently they said the rumor around town was that all those people worked for the CIA or FBI and were reassigned all of a sudden. Over the summer there was a guy found hanging from a tree on the sheriff's property. The sheriff disliked this young man and treated him poorly during his incarceration at the county jail. Many witnesses said that the day he got released from jail, the sheriff invited him to his secluded property and told him he could help him get back on his feet. 2 days later, a couple of teenage boys fishing in a creek discovered the guy hanging in a tree. Authorities was notified, no investigation was done, and it was immediately ruled a suicide. This boy was a known drug addict with no family or friends, so there was really no one to press the issue. The local news wrote a small article on man found dead from apparent suicide, and then it was hush hush after that. It's just one of those things we will never know. Everyone knows about the fun part of Centralia Park, the spooky mine fire, the ghost town, etc. What most don't know about was how divided the town became, and how they ganged up on the kid who fell in, Todd, how they harassed him, and accused him of lying for political gains. He was just a little kid who suffered a near-death experience and his own neighbors started a smear campaign against him. Is this the place that Silent Hill was inspired by? The films? Yes. The games? No. Not so much a dark secret, but my town houses a bombing range that is still in use. No one has ever met anyone who works on it. No kids at school ever parents who work there. We never see planes or anything but there is a guard at the gate. What was truly odd is that, if you ask a resident about it, we all say the same thing. Oh, the bombing range, there's nothing out there. In Mom's seaside hometown, there's a decommissioned lighthouse offshore. Even though utilities to the lighthouse have long been disconnected and the building locked, residents have noticed the beacon turn on at late hours of the night, just for a few minutes, then mysteriously grow dark again. It happens so infrequently that the time of illumination can't be predicted. As I once described here, no one has figured out how or why this happens. I wouldn't say that it's kept secret, but it's so horrific no one really wants to bring it up. A young, early 20s, mentally challenged woman was out with a male family friend and his friend who were a little younger, I think 18 and 19 at the time. They picked her up and drove her to the woods where they repeatedly stabbed her and then lit her on fire while she was still alive. If that wasn't awful enough, they went back to reburn her body a few days later. She had rejected advances that they were making on her. Her body was found by hikers a few days after she was killed, and a few weeks later both boys were arrested. Both of them plead guilty, but offered no reason for why they did what they did. The Garnerville Pits Massacre. Multiple women murdered at a remote swimming area in an old abandoned quarry. One girl survived, but the killer was never identified. Not long later a woman was found dead in a storage shed owned by the sheriff at the time. They arrested a black man who was from out of town with no connections to the woman and sentenced him to life. It later came out that the sheriff had been having an affair with the woman, but charges were never filed. Some speculate that the sheriff could be responsible for multiple murders including the bloody Garnerville Pits Massacre. My childhood town was very small. About 1,000 people maybe. Our neighbor had kids and then was arrested for the discovery of meth lab in their basement. Parents went to jail, kids went to foster care. Still don't know how they are doing to this day. There was this girl in my class. She, like most of the area, lived on badly run farm. She would vanish from class for weeks on end. No one knew the father but everyone was sure he existed and lived on the farm. School district would force the parents to send their kid to school and she would for a few weeks and then vanish again. Only her mother appeared in public and she just radiated mental illness and hard living. I remember the girl very quiet, never talked about home. I don't want to imagine the hell that was her childhood. Homesteading and homeschooling where no one can see their bruises. In my town we have a corrupt police department, maybe 10 officers in this entire department. An incident last year that happened to my past friend involved an officer. He and his mom were going to the capital of the state and left around 1 AM. They got to Main Street and a police cruiser hit their car, resulting in my friend's younger brother breaking his arm. The police then just backed out and left. My friend's mom tried to file a report but was denied. Crazy shit. In my hometown there were quite a few times where we'd find random bodies floating in the swamp and little investigation was done outside of identification. There was also a cop who only arrested blonde-haired girls in attempt to get them to fuck him instead of going to jail. He was fired, but we as a town quickly forgot about it. A boy I went to high school with murdered a sex trafficking victim and raped her corpse in a hotel near our college campus. He was caught fleeing down the interstate and is now serving a life sentence without parole. I suppose it's not a huge secret, but the hotel changed its name and it's all business as usual. My grandparents made a trip down to see the family recently and booked their room at the very hotel. I didn't have the heart to tell them because my grandma would have had an aneurysm. A small northern English town. We have a local mafia who collude and control all the property in the town center. They are an estate agent, a retired estate agent and a publican who buys up every small property to add to his empire of tourist accommodation. It's not really kept a secret, but a pyramid scheme has been going on for several years. The dude was caught about 2 years ago and taken to trial. He bribed the jury. He was set for a retrial, but then something happened with the presidency, not related to the case, and it just didn't happen. Nobody really talks about it. The rate of children being kidnapped seems to be going up also. Nobody will talk about that either. The legend of Moldar comes from my hometown in southern Maryland. Not so much a secret, but I was surprised how many people where I'm from had never heard of her. In the 17th century, a woman named Moldar was suspected of being a witch. On a freezing winter night the townsfolk formed a mob and drove her out of her home. She froze to death clinging onto a large boulder in the woods. The boulder was moved to the old jailhouse in the 70s to memorialize her, and people who go near it frequently report feeling cold and experiencing headaches, dizziness, and fainting. Friend went missing for 3 days. His dog kept pawing at a door in town, so finally cops went inside the house with a warrant. Guy confessed to killing him, stabbing him to death and eventually tried to hack him to pieces to dispose of the body. Never would have found him if not for the dog. Back in the 70s a guy turned up dead in his burned out truck in a field near town. Nobody knew why he was killed or who did it. My grandma was asking around about it at the bar afterwards, and then the next day she got an anonymous phone call telling her to shut the fuck up about it or she would be next. There's a girl from my hometown Elkton named Rachel Good. In 2003 she went missing. She is the only missing case from Elkton I know of. Her parents discovered romantic letters between her and a Elkton police officer, Officer Williams. Williams was married, and Rachel was recently pregnant before her disappearance. After she was reported missing, the town started investigating. Well, Officer Williams was the lead investigator for the town and had full control over it until 10 days later, when Virginia State Police stepped in. Her body has never been found. She was declared dead in 2010 and Officer Williams resigned and moved to Louisiana in 2004. We live in a valley, so the mountains and caves are plentiful. It's hard to tell where her body is, but Rachel's parents are still fighting the officer in court to prove he killed her. Williams has found many ways around the court system so far. A couple sacrificed their newly born child for monetary gain. They were beaten and handed over to the police. Their house was burnt to ashes. I lived in small town in Utah. House across from us got SWAT raided. They found a ton of drugs stuffed in the walls. Few years later like 20 cop cars were on my street. Still don't know why. And finally, my second cousin who lived a little ways away was caught for running the nation's largest fentanyl operation in US history. Yes, it was Orange Shamo. Interesting times. We were riding on our normal bus route when all of a sudden the bus was stopped and asked all us kids to look the other way. I didn't hear and looked a different way. I saw a body hanging from a bridge. Everyone who saw it must go to the schoolroom and wait for a lecture of what had happened. The man had killed himself and didn't like this world anymore. The whole day the people that knew couldn't talk about it. I cried for him knowing that he was dead and would never be back again. In my town, while I was in high school a few years back, this family man that everyone knew and loved who worked at the community ice rink set up cameras in the high school girls hockey changing room. They were there for a while apparently, and when people found out, they sent him away or something, but he didn't go to prison, cause he's back in town and everyone's acting like nothing happened. I remember my friends on the hockey team being really paranoid after that, feeling like they were being watched constantly, and some of them felt powerless, knowing he didn't go to prison for what he did. There was a really high profile murder case in my town a while ago. A woman married to a very important businessman was found dead in their suburbs home. Apparently the husband had ties to the state governor at the time and was rumored to act as his figurehead. His wife wanted a divorce, which meant she would keep a large sum of this dirty money. It was obvious to everyone at the time who did it, but the crime scene was so contaminated, they brought in a fucking priest to bless the corpse before calling the cops. The case was archived. It's evidently a cover-up but everyone pretended to forget about it. I pass by that house every day on my way to work, and it's creepy as fuck. I live in a small Kentucky town. The darkest thing that I heard about in its history, but never talked about, was a lynch mob. Story time. Back in April 1911 a black man was accused of shooting a white man after a bar fight. The local sheriff arrested the black man and tried to hide him in the basement of an opera house. Word quickly spread however, and a mob of 50 white men went to the opera house, overpowered the sheriff and his deputies, and got the black man. They hog-tied him and put in the middle of the stage. They then had the idea to make people pay to shoot him, and the proceeds would go to the killed white man's family. Anyone who purchased an orchestra seat was allowed to shoot him. Of the 200, nearly half hit the black man. The rest destroyed the wooden scenery behind them. The members of the mob were arrested, and the leaders were charged with murder.